Overwatch has quickly become a game about dominating the enemy tank. Tanks are so powerful that they warp the entire game around them. And whether you're running for your life every single game, or you're having a hard time carrying your team, shutting down the enemy tank is the easiest way to win in Overwatch 2, period. That's why in this video, we're going to go over every tank and talk about ways that you can shut them down regardless of the role you play, and set yourself up for less frustration and more wins in Overwatch 2. But it says only 20% of you subscribe, so do me a solid and press that subscribe button right now, and let's get right into the video. There's something that a lot of you don't know about, and it's the fact that ping matters a crazy amount when you're playing games like Overwatch. High ping, you'll be responsive, hitting crispy shots, but low ping, you'll get ton of hit regs, and the game will feel sluggish at best. And sometimes you're gonna get thrown into random queues, so your ping will be random, but GearUP 2.0 is just the fix for that. GearUP ensures the best and most stable network performance when connecting to any NA and EU server, allowing you to choose what server you're connecting to. This means that whenever you queue up Overwatch, you're gonna have the best ping possible, the game's gonna feel really responsive, and you're gonna stop dying like this. Now for you console players, no worries, because they have HyperRev, which is a game router specifically designed to give you the best latency. So if you have problems with packet loss ping, or just want to have a better overall Overwatch experience, you definitely need to check out GearUP 2.0 right now in the links down below. Now, the first character we definitely got to talk about is D.Va. D.Va is a freaking menace right now, and she's incredibly powerful at shutting down DPS or even diving support. Let's take this one role at a time. What can you do to shut down a D.Va or make it a lot harder for a D.Va to do their job? First off, as a DPS, positioning is everything against a D.Va. If you are within booster range from a D.Va, you could get shut down incredibly easily. A D.Va's gonna fly in your face with DM, and if they have reasonable tracking, you are just gonna die. So you need to make sure that you are spacing appropriately against a D.Va, and you are also saving your movement cooldown and not using them overly aggressive so that a D.Va can punish you or swat you down like a fly. Now, the best way to shut a D.Va down, though, as a DPS, is to get in her head. Find out what she is paying attention to and what she is not, and find ways to dump large amounts of damage into her in the moments that she is being aggressive trying to punish another teammate. As a great example of this, let's say you have a Widowmaker, you know that Widowmaker is slightly out of position, and you're on Cassidy, as a hypothetical. It's a good idea to know that that D.Va is heavily gonna hunt that player, heavily going to punish that Widow, and in those moments, you can overtax her health total by dealing a lot of damage to her. In those moments, you can punish her from being overly aggressive and basically not allow her to go and punish that player for free. This requires you to not only be making sure that you are not feeding into a D.Va's effective range and you're doing all the stuff we talked about previously, but you're also aware when your teammates are vulnerable targets, and you make sure to pair the aggression of a D.Va onto your teammates with an equivalent amount of aggression from you onto the D.Va or other members on the enemy team, because that D.Va cannot booster to both you and the Widowmaker. She can't punish both of you at the same time, so there's a window for you to actually trade out that value in some meaningful way. Now, as far as what characters are really good against D.Va, pretty much no one is great against D.Va, but you can definitely play characters that have great mobility because they're not going to be as targeted by a D.Va, and characters that are hit scan or with low mobility, not a great way to get out, are definitely going to be really easy for D.Va to target, so keep that in mind. Now, let's talk about supports for a second, because I think supports against D.Va is incredibly important. It's one of the most important things that you need to master if you want to shut down a D.Va. A good support can make it so a D.Va is not popping off and killing everybody, but a bad support is letting their team die over and over again. So what's the difference? How are you going to be a great support against the D.Va? Similar to what we talked about before, you need to be in the mindset of that D.Va. You need to know when your teammates are going to be under stress. You need to know when your teammates are taking an aggressive angle, and you need to know when someone is going to need to be bailed out of a situation. Because oftentimes D.Vas have a cycle where they get full health, have DM, have their boosters, see someone out of position, go in, trade their DM for resources, damage, or maybe they're eating heals or abilities, and then they deal damage while they're taking damage, and then they retreat, right? And they get to not die, they get to kind of reset, they get to go back to their team. Every single time a D.Va does that, there's an opportunity for someone to make a play. There's an opportunity for the tank to be aggressive and that D.Va to not punish it or not peel for their teammate. So the more cycles you can make a D.Va waste her time, the better and better your chances are at shutting her down and countering her and winning the game. So you need to make sure that you're ready to intervene in every single one of her all-in engages. If you are using a lot of cooldowns in the neutral that can be used to help a teammate when they get jumped on by a diva, then you are effectively letting your teammate die. And if you can waste that diva's time, if you can make it so that diva has to leave, back off, then it's a really, really good idea to save those resources. So please keep in mind everyone that is in a bad position. Really identify who's the one that the diva is most likely going to jump on, and be extra careful, especially when you are playing characters that can get a lot of their heals eaten. Characters like Ana can have a really hard time dealing with the diva because they can't save someone that is being dove on and killed with micro missiles and DM because their heals don't go through. So I'd say that in general, characters can struggle against diva that either can be chased down and caught. So characters like Mercy are actually pretty bad against diva because diva can really punish them, find them, start to apply a lot of pressure to them, prevent them from auto healing. And then characters that can get their heals eaten, characters like Ana, can have a really rough time against diva as well. You can still make it work, but you have to space really appropriately. And there are going to be some situations where you just can't interact in a great way. But a character that is like fantastic against diva is a character like Brig, capable of zoning her away, whipping her away, constantly triggering Inspire, which is going to elevate the overall healing of the team enough to the point where a diva is going to have a lot harder of a time confirming kills. You're going to be able to pack people. There's a lot about a Brig that is really good against the diva for many of the same reasons that a character like Ana is bad against the diva, or can be. Now, last but certainly not least, we do need to talk about tanks up against diva. And really, some of the tanks that you think is great against diva, characters like Zarya, it's going to be map dependent whether or not that's true. Because Zarya needs the diva to fight in her effective range. And on a lot of maps, diva can play the high ground, can force players in bad positions, and then just leave their effective range, not even fight the Zarya. But on some maps, really flat maps, then diva is going to be forced to fight a lot more. And it's going to be much harder for the diva to thrive. So just saying, hey, swap Zarya, it counters diva, this may or may not be true depending on the situation. So keep that in mind. Just because you see a diva and you swap to Zarya every single time, you probably are going to get packed up and lose over and over again and not really know why. Like as an example, playing Zarya against a diva on King's Row first on attack, fantastic because you can force her to contest, and then she's playing into your effective range. But that's a lot harder to do on a map like Nubani, where there's more natural high ground, steeper high ground, especially when we talk about the second part of the map entirely. The diva can come down, drop down, go back up. She could play with the high ground a lot more. So it's a lot harder to force her into the engagements that you want to have. So that's just one example of a character that you might think is great against diva, but not always so. In general, diva has fairly good or even matchups across the board. She's really good against a lot of different characters. I would actually say her hardest matchup is going to be Sigma on the poke maps, and then in the neutral, Doomfist a lot of the time, because Doomfist can punch her out of her DM, Doomfist can punch her into the wall, can zone her out away from her team, and diva's DM doesn't stop a lot of what Doom wants to do, a lot of Doom's damage. So that's a pretty reasonable matchup, but for the most part, she has a lot of game against a lot of characters depending on how good she is. She can DM the slams and the follow-up with ball. She can really punish Winstons. She can eat hog hooks. There is kind of a more fair matchup there. She can eat a lot of Ryan's fire strikes. Ram, I think, is a little bit advantaged against her, but it's pretty close. And Mauga, she's really good against. The Junker Queen is dependent on the map and the situation. Like, there are a lot of more skill-based or even matchups against her. But the number one tip I would give you playing tanks against the diva is recognize when that diva is in a place where you can help your team to stop her, or when she is not. So if you're a tank on the front line and that diva goes and flies up to the high ground to contest your hit scan, your Widow, your Ashe, whatever, right? And you are a tank that does not have the means to interact with that. You're a Junker Queen, maybe you're a Roadhog, but you're not in position to hit a hook, maybe you're a Ryan, whatever. It is your job to replace the lack of presence with aggression on the front line. Like, you cannot interact with that. So there's no point in looking back at your team. There's no point in yelling comms, doing all this crazy stuff. You need to replicate or replace the lack of a presence with your presence and your pressure and your aggression. Don't allow the enemy team to be able to constantly pump resources into that diva in your backline, the one that you cannot stop, because you're not applying enough pressure. If you start applying pressure, then those supports cannot just pocket that diva. Then that diva is missing out on potential peel because they are not there to stop you. You might be able to trade out in situations that you can't save. And this is going to be a piece of advice that I reiterate throughout the video, but I want you to start getting used to those concepts where it's not always about saving your team. Like, you want to save them in some situations when you can interact with them, right? If that diva does dive on your Widow, you can hook them and demech them. That's great, but there's not always those opportunities. And when there's not, that doesn't mean you just stand there and do nothing. In fact, sometimes you need to be over-aggressive to compensate for your teammates being removed partially from the fight and not allow that diva to get all the resources possible. Now, next up, we're going to talk about Doomfist. And while diva is super dominant right now, Doomfist not as much so, although a really great Doomfist can take over a lobby. So I want to talk specifically about how to shut down a carry Doomfist. What do you do on every single role? What's your main thought process against a Doomfist? So we're going to start once again on DPS, and against a Doomfist, of course, you need to not charge his punch. Have a really good idea of when the Doomfist has a charge punch, because that's going to fundamentally change how he plays, and you need to know when he has his ultimate. Because the thing about a good Doom is they are going to cycle in and out of fights. They're going to slam in, punch out, slam in, block, punch out, or punch out, turn around, block. They're gonna cycle a lot, and the thing that they're cycling for, they're not only creating space on the front line, but they're trying to get power punch, empowered punch, and they're trying to get their ultimate. When a Doomfist has both of these things, this is the green light for a Doomfist to do something that can carry the whole fight. They can go freaking nuts. So the more often you give them empowered punch, the more often they're going to be able to do something crazy to potentially carry the fight. So you don't really want to do that. They're going to get ults more too, and they're going to be able to go all in. But especially when they have empowered punch, you need to be careful about them making a very proactive play. And when they have both empowered and their ultimate, you can be ensured that they are going to do something very proactive. And here's the simple reason why. Doomfist is a lot worse at just holding or occupying space than a lot of other tanks. Whether it's Orisa or Junker Queen or Ramatra or Sigma, Doomfist has a really hard time just standing there contesting an objective, or he just doesn't do it as good as some of these other characters, right? But the trade-off here is that there are really, really high moments with Doomfist. If you get the empowered punch, if you get the ultimate, you can go for these crazy plays that individually can have such a huge impact. You can win an entire team fight off of that engagement, and you can get that engagement many times throughout the course of a game. So that's really what Doomfist want to do. They are decent enough at playing the front line, contesting objectives, occupying space, but really when they build these things together, that's when they're trying to make their mark, and they're trying to do this as much as possible. So a Doomfist is not going to have empowered punch, and he's not going to have ultimate and just sit there and do nothing. He's going to look for an opportunity to carry the fight, to wipe the team, to do something, right? And so in that moment, you need to look for an opportunity to interrupt his engagement or force him to ult early. This means being really careful about corners you go past, because the Doomfist is often going to charge a punch when you're wrapping a corner and he's trying to get a slam in, and then he's going to try to ult in. So you would like to be careful. Sometimes you can even bait him to miss the punch, or you be really careful about your positioning across or around corners, right? You got to be really deliberate with when you're committing to open space and when you're playing cover, because when you're naturally jiggling that corner over and over again, playing right at that corner's edge, that's exactly where Doomfist wants you to be, and he's going to be able to get a really great punch in right there. Also, just generally positioning places that don't have walls behind you, whether you're playing on the high ground somewhere where if he punches you, he's just going to punch you off, or playing more in open space. Because the cycles of Doom, when you have a lot of other types of tanks, you can actually hold open space a lot easier than the enemy team. So you can fight for open space more and be less susceptible to getting punched in the wall and things like that. You can also play far more split from your team. You don't have to all stack up. In fact, it's really bad to stack up against Doomfist with Empower Punch. He's going to be able to hit all of you, get giant amounts of ult points, ban a lot of cooldowns. So it's great to take alternate angles, especially when you know a Doomfist is going to go for a really big play because he has both Empowered Punch and his ultimate once again. And then doing giant amounts of burst damage to the Doom in the middle of his first engagement to the point where the Doom has to ult early. You see, a Doomfist is going to be able to get heals back with his shields and his health regen in his ultimate, so he's not so worried about what his health is when he pops the ult. He's just worried about dying before he gets to pop an ult. So he's going to play on the safe side, and you would like him to get less value on the front end so that he has to get more value when he comes down with his ultimate. As far as characters that are really good against Doomfist, basically characters that can play Skybox, you know, characters like Pharah, characters like Echo. These characters can be pretty difficult for Doomfist to interact with. In addition to that, I think a lot of characters have game against Doomfist, but it's really going to be a skill-based matchup. Like a really good Doom can bait at a lot of cooldowns, can deny Cassidy Grenade, and still outplay a lot of characters. But if you're good enough, if you hit enough crits, if you don't empower him enough, and if you're just more disciplined and just a better overall player, you can really come out on top against a worse Doom. But I would say spending a little bit of time on Doom, regardless of what role you play, can better help you understand the cycles that he goes through, specifically his mindset and his intentions at multiple stages in the game, which is going to help you better read him and make better plays against him. Let's talk about supports, and supports don't have the same tools to deal with the Doom, but they have maybe even better tools to deal with the Doom. So they can't really typically burst a Doom in the same way that a DPS can. Some of them can, like Alari, but generally they have less overall burst potential, and that's not really how they interact with Doomfist cycles. More so, they have abilities that, when timed properly, can mitigate the all-in moments of a Doom. Abilities like Suzu can be incredibly effective at denying initial empowered punches and putting Dooms in really bad positions. And especially when used with proper timing up against the Doom, can really be very frustrating on the Doom's end and make it so that that Doom is missing out on a ton of potential value. And I would say that if you're up against only a Doom and no other dive characters, this is pretty easy to do. You just save your cooldowns to deny Doom and you time them around his engages. This is super easy and really impactful. But when there are other divers and there's other things you need to use Suzu on at all times, it can be much more difficult. And I would say that that's where the real challenge lies, where you're not only positioning safe to the point where you can help your team, but you're also making sure that you are playing effective range against a lot of other divers, characters like Tracer, characters like Genji. You're kiting a lot more and you're playing your range instead of just relying on the power of your mitigation abilities overly much, because if you're forced to burn them, then the Doomfist has an opportunity to make a really hard carry play. So someone that's really good and maybe confident on a character like Kiriko are like, yeah, I don't care about a Tracer. Come at me, man. Come at me. And you fight the Tracer. You use your Suzu. You're still fighting the Tracer. You teleport. You're like, oh, I'm chilling. But in the actuality, that Tracer is baiting all your abilities and forcing you to be in a bad position up against the Doom. And then you could be really confident but be getting denied over and over again because of that. So it's important to think about the Doom as something that if you can stop, that's the key to really winning the game very easily. So think about ways that you can save your cooldowns to deny him. Now, hard CC, either counter bashing on Brig or sleeping him on Ana, these things are so deadly to Doom. Most of the time will just cause him to die or feed. And then similar to DPS, you need to keep a track of his cycles and understanding when a Doom is ready to all in and how he's gonna play his Empower Punch plus his ultimate. If you can do that, you're going to be pretty well set to deal with him. Now, last up, certainly not least, we have Tank. For a lot of matchups, Doomfist has game against you. The thing that you need to be careful of is Doom canceling out your abilities with a simple punch, and there's a lot of characters he can do this with. So if you're a Junker Queen and you shout and swing in, Doomfist can punch you back, effectively making your shout worse and canceling your cleave, which is just really bad. So you really want to bait out a punch first before you do something like that. Diva, he can just punch you away, so flying in really obvious patterns are directly at him. He's just going to punch you away, CC you back, cancel your DM. You're going to take a ton of damage from the front. Not going to be a great look. Characters like Ryan have a really hard time against Doom unless you can hit him with a pin, because Doom is going to be able to just punch you back and back and back. Characters like Ram are also going to have a rather frustrating time because your brawl mode basically doesn't do anything against the Doom, and he can keep punching you and mitigating those abilities. And he has a decent amount of game against characters like Sigma and Ball and Winston. So it's not really necessarily how you interact with the Doom. It's more about what you can do to mitigate his cycles and then take advantage of the lack of frontline pressure. Remember what we talked about. The weakness to Doomfist is that he is worse at contesting space than almost every other tank in the game. He is not good at standing on an objective. He is not good at occupying a place. So if you can keep making sure to apply pressure on an objective, do that a lot. And when he goes into your backline, either punish him with objective progress or punish him by engaging in his backline, making it so that they're just dying, and then Doom has to feel like he's always gonna need to peel, which is not really the best case scenario for Doom at all times. So really, you're gonna lose to a Doom by allowing a Doom to not really get punished for what he's weak at, and it's really, really important that you take advantage of that. But enough about Doom. Let's talk about Junker Queen, who's up next. And Junker Queen is a rather powerful tank in the right hands, but there's a lot of ways to interact with Junker Queen in a way that shuts them down, makes them a lot less effective. Let's first talk about the DPS once again. Specifically with Junker Queen, she is the most fragile out of the tanks, as in she can really get punished by eating a crit to the head in a lot of different situations with a lot of characters, right? In fact, there's a lot of characters that actually can keep poking at the queen and really punish her in a way that other tanks might be able to shrug it off. If you're Pharah, shooting at the queen a lot. If you're Echo, minding the queen, beaming the queen. There's a lot of characters that when they start to pressure the queen is under a lot of pressure, a lot of tax, and she'll waste cooldowns. She'll waste things like her shout. And it's really important that you do that so that you get opportunities to be aggressive on the rest of the team without that queen being able to like punish back. When Queen doesn't have her shout, her team is weaker and more vulnerable, as defensively she can't shout. And there's also less repercussions for being aggressive because that queen's not going to shout, go cleave your backline, right? So being able to bait that out, and you can do that really easily as a DPS, is phenomenal. Now, you have to be really careful around corners versus Junker Queen. Junker Queen's really good at playing little certain choke points and corners. The second you walk in a little bit, she's going to shout, she's going to swing around that corner. You never want to allow the Junker Queen to get into melee range or effective range to you without committing shout, because then you're going to use whatever ability you have to get her away, and then she's going to be able to shout and close in that gap again. Now, the scary thing, of course, is the knife. If she hits really god-tier knives, there's not that much you can do about it. I'm going to be honest with you. But making sure that you are not just playing obvious lanes, you're playing natural cover really, really tightly, and being deliberate with the moments that you're pushing out. And most of the time, you want to return the wave, right? If you can't bait out that shout with you dealing damage to the queen, let the queen come in, play a little bit more on the defensive side. Let the queen shout and cleave and do all that stuff, right? And then when they don't have it, the backswing needs to be aggressive. It's like the tide comes in, and then you send the tide back at them because they don't have that shout anymore, which is a lot of what makes Junker Queen threatening and powerful, is that. So you need to take advantage of those moments, right? Now, as far as supports are concerned, a lot of the same advice that I gave previously with DPS, very similar with supports, where you're just talking about the push and pull of Junker Queen, and you're making sure to track her shout. Super, super important. Another thing I would say is you need to be really careful about your positions. There's a lot of supports, like Ana's especially, characters like that like to stand still a bit too much. They're not as aware of their surroundings, and a queen could just turn the corner real quick, hit you with the knife, pull you in, and kill you. And you can't make that easy. You cannot make those knives easy for queens. You need to be more aware of your surroundings, or else you're just gonna get feasted on by this queen over and over again. I would also say something that's really good against queen in general is just high ground. She doesn't have vertical mobility, so if you can play high grounds and then force the queen to come up and contest you, but then use an ability to push them off the high ground, whip, or you're booping her off as Lucio, making it so that you always have high ground control. This could be something really, really powerful, because that Junker Queen needs to get in range to interact, and they're going to have to route back up, and they're going to have to bait out your CC. That's the only way that they're going to be able to interact with you in a meaningful way. I would also say constantly rotating and playing longer effective ranges is going to be pretty effective against Junker Queen, because the character just wants to be in close range at all times. Now, last up, we do got to talk about tanks against Queen, and it's gonna kind of range. I don't really think that Queen has absolute great, amazing matchups, but nothing really bad either. Queen shout can enable a variety of different types of comps, whether it's brawl, whether it's dive. And a lot of the time, that queen is going to try to ignore you if she doesn't really feel like she's that great in the head-to-head, right? And there are going to be different ways to interact with that depending on the character you are. Like Azara, for instance, in the head-to-head, pretty good against the Junker Queen. That Junker Queen's going to look for an opportunity to dip past you. So having a bubble to be able to bail out your teammates when the Junker Queen's going in really aggressively, or saving bubbles so that you can go in on the queen's backlines and the queen's not going to be able to save her backline, because you're going to be able to trade out basically on the backline. That's one great example. And there's going to be a lot of characters that they don't want to fight the queen directly. They would much prefer for that queen to go in and then them to counter jump. Like a Winston doesn't want to ever have to peel a queen, doesn't want to have to ever jump anywhere near a queen. They want the queen to come in, and then they want to basically trade out the backline, trade out value in the backline. Now, how valuable this is going to be dependent on how easy it is for you to get value in the backline, either by yourself or with your team, or how easy it is for the Junker Queen to get value in your backline. Like, ideally, you would have a hypermobile team that everyone can get away from the queen, and the second the queen's aggressive, everyone goes in on their backline, and the queen's kind of trying to play peel and trying to catch up and interact, right? But in a world where her backline's really difficult to interact with, and your backline is getting freaking smushed, and you can't play peel against queen, those are the situations where I think swapping is warranted. But in a lot of cases, adopting your play or changing your play is going to be just good enough to deny a queen from getting that max amount of value and getting a lot of value yourself. Next up, we got to talk about Mauga. Mauga can be pretty frustrating to deal with depending on what role you play, especially tank players have a frustrating time, but pretty much everyone has a frustrating time against Mauga in some situations. But for DPS, let's talk about what you can do against Mauga. Oftentimes, there's going to be moments where you're not really going to want to interact with the Mauga directly. You want to make sure that the Mauga is not in a position to be able to come and push you or interact with you directly, because oftentimes what you want to do against the Mauga is deal with him later on in the team fight. He's really good at attrition. He's really good at tanking a lot of damage. We're going to talk about Orisa in a second, and it's similar in the way that if you're putting everything you got into Mauga the whole game, you're getting a lot less value out of that than focusing on other things. So as a DPS, I would look for ways that you can stay away from the Mauga and not get destroyed by him or in his charge range or effective range at all, and find moments where you can shut down enemy DPS or shut down enemy supports. DPS are going to be a little bit easier because you don't have to all-in flank. You can fight them on off angles where Mauga can't really interact all that easily. And generally, this is going to be the effective thing to do against a Mauga, because you do not want to just fight a Mauga and allow a Mauga to get a ton of value. If your tank is focusing him, if everyone's focusing him, he's getting pumped with heals and he's healing himself. It can be really difficult to try to kill him, and I would say it's not even worth it the majority of the time. However, I want you to be always ready to pivot onto a Mauga in key situations, and there's a couple of them. Number one, the Mauga is super, super low and all in too far to the point where it's a hard time them getting out. Obviously, you want to focus the tank then because he's super out of position and, you know, he wasted his cooldowns and you could just kill him. If the Mauga gets naded, this is a great example of a moment where you can focus the Mauga, or in situations where the enemy resources are low enough, you killed enough people, now the Mauga's alone, then you can start focusing on the Mauga again. And if you could do it from a really safe position and there's nothing else for you, then of course you could shoot the Mauga for sure. It's a good idea to try to trigger that DPS passive on that Mauga every once in a while, regardless, even if you're not going to be focusing him for an extended period of time, just so that that Mauga isn't like perma-full and requires or demands no resources from his team. It's a good idea to tax it a little bit more. Now, there's a lot of characters that are reasonable against Mauga. They just fight not Mauga. They fight other characters. They're either trading with poke. Characters like Ashe are really good at doing that, or they're looking for fights on off angles, or they're divers and they're just completely ignoring a Mauga and they're trying to go into the back line and kill the supports or kill the DPS, right? These are really good, but there's also characters that can brute force through a Mauga. Characters like Bash and characters like Reaper, if they have the proper setups, they can just destroy a Mauga in the straight up, but typically they need some extra resources with their team. Oh, another indicator, by the way, to focus a Mauga is if there's some form of mitigation, you know, a Sigma shield in front of him, or maybe it's a Diva DM. There's a lot of situations where if that Mauga doesn't have any form of heals or isn't able to heal himself, you can focus him in that moment. But I would say like communication is needed in that regard. Now, I'd say next up with the support role against Mauga, you want to make sure that you're not in a position where the Mauga can single you out. Mauga is going to be able to feast on you if you're out of position, run at you, slam down on you. Playing your range is really, really important, and making sure that you have a buddy system. Honestly, being able to play next to each other, near each other, bail each other out, and having your other support and DPS in mind when Mauga goes in aggressive. This is all important. When people are on fire, you're making sure to top them up. Things like that, making sure that you are not being able to be isolated, because the Mauga is going to look for opportunities where he can really basically cut in and actually get a confirmed kill. but also any way that you can enable your DPS to actually get value on characters that are not Mauga is great. Being able to speed boost your Cassidy around so that he can take aggressive off-angle duels, being able to nade the back line so that your diver can go in, doing proactive stuff like this on other characters is going to get a lot more value most of the time than just doing it on Mauga in the neutral. Like, it's really easy to hit him with all your abilities, right? He's really huge, and he's right there, and he's menacing, but you're oftentimes going to be wasting so many cooldowns that could actually generate a kill for a DPS if you were helping them off angle, if you were enabling them in some way. Now, last up, let's talk about tanks. There's a lot of great tanks against Mauga, but it kind of depends on the situation. Characters like D.Va are really, really great because they can eat Mauga's DM and they can deny his heals. There are certain characters like Sigma that can poke him out in the right situations, and other characters can completely ignore him. It's really going to depend on a couple of situations, like what the map are, what is your team composition, and ways that you can stop Mauga from getting a lot of heal-based value. If you're just running at him as Roadhog and constantly keeping him full and never really killing him or denying him anything, then you're probably throwing. So I would just say don't do that, and you're going to be just fine. Now, similar though, I would like to see you find situations where you can be proactive on enemy backlines or enable your DPS or your team to make a play on someone on the off angle, right? The goal is not necessarily to kill the Mauga first, because it's not reasonable. The goal is to mitigate the Mauga's overall value. So a lot of times that comes from not even interacting with him and making sure that you can kind of enable something else that your team is doing, so that the Mauga either has to play Peel, which is just really not good at, or you get value and then you go back to the front line. You know, you aided your team, but then you're back to the front line, right? Now, next up, we do got to talk about Orisa. And Orisa hasn't been all that strong right now, but let's talk about a couple of things. If you're still struggling against Orisa, what can you do across the roles? For DPS, similar to Mauga, I'm not going to make this too complicated. You just don't really want to fight the Orisa. Orisa has a lot of mitigation abilities. She really thrives on being the center of attention, being the center of focus. You want to look for opportunities to find value on off angles, on other targets, on support, on DPS off angling, and not be in an effective range in Orisa where she can just shut you down really easily. If you're in a high ground position that's on an off angle, that Orisa better have to hit a magical spear in order to get you off that angle. She should not be able to walk up to you and slam you to the wall with a spear, or you're in a terrible freaking position. So please don't do that. And I have a huge breakdown on dealing with Orisa as an entire guide that you can go check out if you wanted more detail. But really, with Orisa not being super meta right now, the simple TLDR is do not focus the Orisa directly unless the Orisa has no cooldowns and they're posturing really defensively, and really they're low resources, so like they already have people dead, right? Not really the first one you want to kill in a team fight. Typically the like third, fourth, or last person you want to kill in a team fight. Now, a lot of the things I talked about with Mauga, it's going to be very similar with Orisa, right? Orisa is a very similar type of tank, a tank that wants to make it so the other tank doesn't get to play the game, the other tank isn't as effective, and in that, you need to find ways to impact the off-angle fights and other fights on the battlefield that don't have to do with the tank, right? As a support, I would not encourage you to constantly nade the Orisa. I would not encourage you to constantly shoot the Orisa. I would not encourage you to constantly discord the Orisa. What I would encourage you to do is to find moments when you can interact with other fights on the battlefield with those utilities. Discord a dived target or an off-angling DPS that can get poked out. Nade someone that is in their back line. Find ways in which you can set up kills with your DPS, set up kills with your tank that is going in aggressively. Don't try to just use all these cooldowns on the Orisa. Instead, save cooldowns in moments that you can't use them on preserving your own life and protecting yourself, instead of just dumping them into this character that just doesn't really care about any of the cooldowns you're using on them because they have a million ways to just mitigate it and just kind of shrug it off, right? Now, of course, tanking is frustrating against Orisa because this character often just prevents you from playing the game. They're going to follow you around, they're going to shut you down, they're going to turn the game into a 50-50. And similar, I'm going to give the same advice I gave you with Mauga. Find moments where you can aid a play from your team. Aid them on an off angle, enable them in some meaningful way, and then go back to dealing with the Orisa. Because the Orisa is not going to leave you alone, right? But if you can give your team a little bit, right? If you can help them a little bit in some specific situation, if you can deny a little bit, right? Look for a moment where the Orisa is just a little bit out of position. Bait her to one side and then dip out and go enable your team to do something proactive. Find moments and windows where that Orisa is not able to just constantly shut you down, and use those to really help enable a play that your team is making somewhere else. Now, if you want to just straight up fight the Orisa, I would say Zarya is just the best. If you want to just straight up brawl the Orisa, you're tired of that shit and you just want to fight it straight up, then Zarya is probably your best bet. But other than that, there's a lot of characters that they're going to get followed around. They're going to try to get denied, and you're just going to look for ways to avoid the Orisa, take high ground if you are a mobility character, or just dip away for a second, help your team, and then go back and take on that Orisa's aggro. But you enabled your team. You set them up. You helped them a little bit. You shouted them in. You did whatever to help them a little bit so that they can actually get value. And the better you are at dipping in and out to doing that and helping your team, the more fights you're going to win overall. Even if you have worse DPS, even if you have a worse team, you're just aiding their plays more than the Orisa is, who's literally only just trying to stop you the whole game. The next up is Ramattra, and Ramattra can be really powerful in the right hands, but also very possible to shut down a Ramattra. To talk about both general and DPS-specific interactions with Ramattra, Ramattra is a character that can do a lot of different things, right? Can poke, can brawl. You need to be very careful of the brawl, but at the same time, if you're just playing this character from range always, the character's going to be poking. They can also brawl defensively to shut you down. So, similar that we talked about other characters, right? The cycle or the moment that Ram is most vulnerable is the moments after they use their brawl form, when they don't have it anymore, and then you take a close fight to them, right? You take a close range fight in the moments that they cannot brawl back at you, right? Jumping in as Winston, just in the neutral, not that great, because they could just brawl you out and punch you out. It could be okay if you get value, but it's gonna be a smaller window, and that Ram is gonna get involved. But if you can bait out or be ready for the brawl form, they go in, they don't get value, they back up. That's the moment. Boom. There's a window right there where they are a pretty poor poke tank that doesn't have the ability to brawl and get active and deny a dive or an aggressive push or an aggressive play. You also just need to generally respect a Ram. Like, if a Ram is in your game getting freaking 25 kills and 1 death, you are not playing effective range against the Ram. You are not tracking the cooldown against the Ram. You are not respecting the Ram's damage. Like, you need to do all these things. That Ram should not be able to beeline across the map or turn a corner, pop brawl, and y'all are right there ready to get pounced on. This happens a lot, and when Rams just completely dominate and pop off, this is happening. And unlike some other characters like Orisa and even Mauga, Ram is actually focusable if the Ram's out of position. And it's a good idea to force that Ram to be defensive, use their block, back up, get into good positions if they are overextended. So when they're really coming in, playing from an off angle from your team, but still interacting with the Ram is really, really powerful. Now, the one thing that you need to be careful of course, is the ultimate. Ultimate can be really oppressive, especially when combined with Nano, and especially when it comes after they all in, they pop their brawl form, then they pop their ultimate, and then they keep brawling, and they're dealing a ton of damage. These are all things that you have to respect. And I would say playing wide off angles when you know that they have this ultimate is really, really great. Being able to shut down enemy DPS and fight enemy supports instead of interacting directly with the Ram. Don't allow that Ram to set up every engagement that they want, right? They want to turn the corner and brawl you. They want to walk at you. You focus them. They pop their ultimate. They get to keep walking through your team. They want everyone to be stacking together so they get a lot of value. Don't let them do all these things in a way that they want to every single time. And this typically comes from positioning, really fundamental, wide, far, off angles, natural cover, so that you're less susceptible to getting poked out by the poke ability, but you're also far enough away and playing your effective range far enough to where the brawl is also being mitigated, right? Now, I'd say that Ram is a pretty 50-50 character, as in they don't really have that many terrible matchups and that many, like, overwhelmingly good matchups. But what I would say is they can't really interact with flyers. They have a hard time interacting with characters that play really far ranges. Characters like Ashe can be frustrating for them to deal with. They're going to like wall you off and poke at you a little bit, but it's not going to be a meaningful impact. And then divers can also be pretty frustrating, especially if it's a whole team of divers, right? You can only brawl on one person at a time. Not the greatest character in the world at peeling. So if the enemy team is super hyper mobile, then Ram is going to have hard times catching people with their brawl and not going to be able to peel all that great. Now, for supports, similar thing. You just need to make sure that you're playing your range and not giving the Ram any brawl value. right? No brawl value. No brawl value at all. When the Ram walks forward, you walk back. You make sure you're playing your effective range. You make sure you're playing your distance. And constantly try to mitigate his brawl abilities. If you're a Brig, you can whip him back. If you're a Lucio, you can boop him back. There's a lot of characters that they can either interact with him by pushing him back, or they can play far outside his effective brawl range. And you need to do one of the two things. You need to stop the brawl or play outside its range, right? Now, there are some abilities that are really freaking strong up against the Ram. Sleep Dart, amazing. Nade, amazing. Ana has a lot of really good ones. Discord, amazing. Really, really great up against him. And a lot of supports can be really powerful depending on how you incorporate it, right? An off-angling DPS that gets to be more independent because of Mercy Pocket can be really, really great as well. There's so many different things that you can do to deal with a Ram, but Ram also has a lot of tools as well. He's going to do everything he can to try to get you out of position and look for those moments. So I will say that a lot of this is easier said than done, as is most things in this world, but it is something that you could definitely play around, and you are 100% giving the Ram way too many free engagements if that Ram is taking over an entire lobby like so many Rams do. So definitely keep an eye on that. Now, tank. Let's talk about tank. I already talked about some direct characters that could be really, really good against Ram like Doomfist, but more than anything, it's about forcing the character into your style of play. Ram can do a little bit of everything. Jack of all trades. So if you are a Junker Queen, you do not want to poke him indefinitely because you want to be on top of him. You want to be freaking trading blows with his brawl. But if you're Sigma, you would much rather play your range and your distance and respect his Nemesis form a lot more and save your rock to deny his brawl form and knock it back so that you're never in a close effective range fight. So it's all about playing the range that you want to play, playing the style that you want to play. And the better that you can enforce that, regardless of the character you're playing, the better time you're going to have at actually just beating the Ram. But if you play a really lukewarm style where you're giving him too much value in multiple aspects of his kit, then his like mediocre or middle of the pack playstyle jack of all trades is filling all the gaps while you're not maxing out on the one thing your character is good at, right? You're not enabling or doing the thing that you're really, really good at. So that's what I'd look out most if you're trying to beat Ram as a tank player. Now, let's talk about Reinhardt. Now, everyone loves Rein, so I could just not give anyone any tips on how to counter a Reinhardt, and then Rein players can be happy, right? But, you know, I gotta be fair. So I'm gonna give you some tips on how to shut a Rein down, because it's actually easier than you think. Sorry, Rein players. Rein is fundamentally a melee tank. He wants to get in close, he wants to swing his goddamn hammer, and he wants to get value, right? He wants to get big shatters, he wants to build up his ult charge, and he wants to apply a ton of pressure. So this is really important because Rein, if he doesn't get to swing on the front line, if he's not allowed to swing on the enemy tank, he's going to go into the enemy backline and try to trade blows, right? Or he could try to peel with a weird pin thing, which can work some of the time depending on how good you are at them. But most of the time, Rein is going to replace the pressure with other pressure, right? Because he cannot interact with a Winston that jumped the high ground. He cannot interact with the Doom that's really far back in their backline. There's a lot of things he cannot interact with, so he's going to go and pressure the things he can interact with on the front line. He's going to go and push whatever is left and apply a ton of pressure. So knowing this, knowing when and where a Rein can interact is super, super important regardless of what character you're playing. Because if you know that he's not going to interact with your freaking Winston that jumped high ground, then you know he's going to be hella aggressive. So you turning that corner and peeking his Ana, you're going to get freaking smacked, okay? And you deserve it. I'm going to tell you that right now. You deserve it because there's nothing else that Rein can do besides backing out the hell up and just giving up space for no reason, right? That's the only play that he has in his book. And that's the thing. That's the reason that it's easy for you to shut down a Rein is because they don't have a lot of plays in their playbook. They have very specific plays in their playbook that they're trying to rely on every single time. And they're hoping that you don't know. And they're hoping that you don't know how to play around it. You don't know that it's coming, but it is. And that's just the thing that you need to think about. And you could be like, but Mills, what if this Rein is brain dead? What if he just pins back and doesn't even care about the front line? He tries to go back and help, even though he can't interact with the high ground in any meaningful way. He tries to fire strike it a couple times. It's better to play on the safe side. Like, if they're going to do that, you're going to win anyways, okay? So, I mean, that does nothing. So, Just expect the opponent Ryan to do the play that is available to him that makes the most sense, and there's only a couple of options. I mean, he can really pin back, he can push in aggressively, or he could try to interact in some way like fire striking, and if that person's on the high ground, he really can't do anything at all that's gonna be impactful. So in a very different way, like I talked about getting in the mindset of D.Va, like that is really, really difficult because you have to look at your gaps, right? The gaps in your team, because the D.Va can do basically anything, right? So you have to look at what the enemy D.Va is going to do based on the gaps and opportunities that you open up to her from your team side. But for Ryan, it's different because the gap is in his ability to interact. What can he interact with? And he can't interact with everything. He wants to swing, he wants to get active, but he can't do that against a ton of characters. He can't do that against a Tracer, a Genji jumping in his backline, against a Pharah flying overhead, against a Winston, a Doomfist, a D.Va. There's a lot of characters he cannot interact with, so he's going to do the play that is available to him. He's very, very simple. You know, he can't do a lot of different things. So if you're a Cassidy that sees your freaking, you know, your Doomfist and your Genji, they jumped in, they jumped the high ground, they're doing something crazy, you know they have a Ryan. This doesn't mean just, you know, walk up and swing peek main on King's Row, because that Ryan's gonna be on your ass. He's gonna be right there, and it's obvious he's gonna be right there because that's the only thing he could do. Okay, I know I keep repeating this, but it's super important to understand, because otherwise you are playing into characters that should not have a chance to do anything to you if you just recognize that they can only do one thing or very specific things. It's kind of like playing rock, paper, scissors, but your opponent can only pick scissors and paper. You know that for a fact. They're never going to pick rock. So you'll never lose if you pick scissors, like no matter what. But then sometimes they're going to pick paper and just instant lose. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. The only way you lose is if you randomly pick rock for no reason and they pick paper, right? That Ryan randomly ints the front line and you choose to swing it close because you want to dash in, get active, get aggressive with your dive that's on the other side of the map, but you know they have a Ryan. I know that in some ways this can feel like an oversimplification, but I promise you that it's actually more simple than it appears. So I think really, regardless of whether you're DPS, tank, or support, I think you need to respect Ryan. Like, if you don't respect him, he's going to be on you and he's going to do some crazy things, because when he's in his close range, when he's in his close effective range, he shields your cooldowns, he starts bashing on you. He can kill an entire team if he gets in the right positions, the right scenarios for him. And that's how Ryans succeed even in top 500. When Ryans are there, it's because Ryans really get a crazy amount of value when they can set up those situations, and they're good at setting them up. They're tricky at setting them up with the pin, with the mobility, but if you can play in a way that doesn't give the Ryan the capability to set those up, you're going to be just fine. Tank, DPS, support, doesn't matter. You're going to be just fine. The next up on the list, we have to talk about Roadhog. This one can be really frustrating, so we're definitely going to go into detail here about how do you shut down this character. So from a DPS point of view, there's a lot you could do to shut down a Hog. So first off, just generally triggering the DPS passive on him, making it so he's going to heal less is good. It's not going to allow him to be killed, by the way. He's very, very difficult to kill without crazy focus fire or some amount of CC or whatever, but it does prevent him from being aggressive, which is good. Like if he's always backing up and healing, this is really good for your overall team, the overall space you're going to take. And a Hog that is not able to get in his proper position and not really take the space he wants to take and not really set up the hooks he wants to set up, he's doing a lot less. He's not really interacting in any meaningful way. So he's a character that you can shoot and you can focus, but just don't shoot him crazy with the intent to kill him all the time. I think that's where DPS players mess up, where they're like, oh, he's low, keep shooting him, keep shooting him. Oh, he's super low, oh, he's so, keep shooting him. I'm gonna dash in, I'm gonna roll in, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, and they don't kill him, right? He's not really that killable. He's not easy to kill at all, but he is good at whittling down, and you gotta understand that you're getting value from him playing passive and constantly healing himself. You don't have to kill him to deny him, right? So don't be so obsessed with the kill and chasing the kill that it causes you to create all these other mistakes, and then maybe you even give the Hog a chance to hit that hook on you. It could be really, really bad. Playing outside of his effective range, very important. Always keeping track of where the Hog is. Ping him whenever you see him. This is all really, really great fundamental stuff. Because oftentimes, as a DPS, you want to play off angles, right? You're fighting other DPS on the off angles. You're trying to find plays on the supports, right? But a Hog is oftentimes lurking in and out of off angles. That's what he does a lot. He's looking for little gaps where he can punish you. So unlike other characters that might just stay on the front line, other tanks, Roadhog is constantly like browsing for a potential pick opportunity. And you have to be aware of him at all times. You can't be caught slacking, or he's going to freaking find that opportunity on you and hook you. And then their DPS is going to have that opening on the right flank because you're dead. And no one's going to be there to shut them down. And then all of a sudden, the whole cookie crumbles, right? So, got to keep that in mind. Now, something about how you play against Hog in the neutral game as a DPS depends on what your tank is. It depends on, does winning the attrition war mean that you win? That is really what it depends on. Like, if I have a ball that is going in and being aggressive and getting these crazy slams, maybe not dying, but he's going in, going in, and going in, I cannot just stand neutral and just constantly poke at the Hog. I'm denying him from pushing, but I cannot push into his space because I have to play effective range. I need to find opportunity to actually increase the kills and the overall impact of the ball's engagements. Even if I had to take an aggressive off angle, I have to find some way to interact with that, because just sitting there and shooting at the Hog all game is not going to win me the neutral fight. I'm not going to be able to break through because my ball is not interacting there. And basically what happens is if I'm poking at the Hog all game in the neutral and my ball is slamming the back line all game, then him and I are doing completely different things and nothing is happening, okay? Nothing is freaking happening. But if I have a Sigma on the front line that is whittling down the enemy's resources, they're taxing their heals, they're taxing their health, they're taxing everything, then I can just stand in the neutral and shoot the damn Hog, because their resources are going to whittle and whittle and whittle and whittle and whittle and whittle while we're all healthy, and everything that they do is going to get shut down, and we're going to win that neutral game. So yes, we're going to have to contest certain things. Yes, we got to make sure that their aggressive players are kept in check. That Widow on the off angle, we got to shut that shit down right away. That Tracer on our backline, we got to shut that shit down right away. But we don't need to go overly aggressive on off angles ourselves when we're winning that attrition game. And this is like a concept that is true for every tank, but I want to not overcomplicate you with these concepts on tanks that they don't directly matter all the time like it does against Hog. But it's good that you watch this even if you don't care about shutting down Hog, because this is a good concept that you can use against every tank and even a lot of characters as well. So basically what it comes down to is you're going to change up how you play against the Hog depending on what your other tank is and how that frontline battle is going. If your tanks are divey and being very aggressive, then you can still apply pressure to the Hog to mitigate his aggression, but you don't want to be all in on shooting this Hog all the time because you're not going to kill him. You're just going to not be involved in the break points that matter in their backline. Now for supports, there's a lot of supports that are good against Hog. Characters that can deal with him directly, Ana, Sleep, nade him, that's always fantastic. Can give you a way to kill him in the neutral. It's one of the few ways to kill him in the neutral, especially if he doesn't have access to like a Suzu right away. And then characters that can mess up his hook interactions, booping him, break whipping him, not able to be hooked very easily. All these things are really good at messing with the Hog and preventing him from getting any hook-based value. You know, if a Hog is not hitting any hooks, consistent hooks, value hooks, he's really just throwing a game. He's not able to carry. So a lot of supports that can deny that, doing a really fantastic job. Now, what I would say as far as tank matchups against Hog, one of the things you have to be the most worried about is him double CCing you or putting you in a really bad position, because he can move you into his team by moving you around the corner, and he can whole hog you, which is the thing you have to be most worried about on a lot of tanks, because most tanks just die to it. Almost all tanks just die to it. Queen, if you're in a bad position, you die. Malga, you just freaking die. Ram, you freaking die. Ryan, you freaking die. Other Hogs, you're gonna die. Ball, you're gonna die. Winston, you're gonna die. Zara, you're gonna die. Like, a lot of tanks get completely bodied by whole Hog. So you have to be careful of that, and you have to be careful getting moved out of position as well. Those are the things that you got to be really careful of, because if Hog has his ult, or if Hog has an area where he can whip you around into his team, body block you, prevent you from getting out, once you're dead, the Hog is free. He doesn't have anything to hold him back on the front line. He doesn't have any need to peel. He gets to just walk it down on your team, who cannot kill him, by the way, and close in that gap, and everyone's going to be like, oh yeah, we got to stay outside of his effective range, so everyone's just going to either back the hell up or die, and that means that Hog just gets everything, right? The second you die in a fight against the Hog as a tank, your team loses, okay? This is really important, and it's not going to be 100% of the time, but a huge percent of the time. If you die, your team loses. Doesn't really matter what you've done up to this point. If the hog is still alive and you're dead, your team loses. You killed 3 people and you die and the hog's alive, your team loses. Okay, I want you to get that in your head because it's really important, because that hog just gets to claim everything. Everything. All the space, all the value, all the entire thing, because your team has no choice but to keep backing up or they die to his hook. They have to respect his hook. They can't just stand there and keep poking with no front line against the hog. It's not going to work, and they're going to die. And the hog can dip in and out of off angles, so there's not really much you can do there. The hog is going to force you away. So this puts extra importance in staying alive as a tank up against the hog than other tanks, even more so. I mean, it's always important to stay alive, but against the hog especially, if you get 2 people with your life, it's not worth it. If you get 3 people, it can be in some situations, but I would be very careful about thinking that doing a lot in their backline, denying a whole bunch of things, popping off in their backline, getting kills, is enough to justify dying when the hog is still alive. Because you're going to end the game freaking 30-7, and you're going to think that you should have won that game, but every single time you died, that hog didn't die, and that hog just got to walk it down on your team, and you just lost a fight and a half for free. Then next up, we have Sigma. Before we talk about specific roles, I want to talk about Sigma specifically as a character on the maps he's really good in. The long distance maps like Circuit Royale and Havana, especially the long distance parts of those maps, like the first part of both those maps, this is freaking Sigma territory. Sigma thrives here more than any other tank, and he's incredibly powerful here more than any other tank. And while there are counter strategies you can do to shut down a Sigma, keep in mind that the best strategy, the majority of the time, is going to just be play a better fundamental game with a Sigma of your own. Because on those stages of the map, it's really hard to get anything going. Like, let's take Circuit first, right? The flank routes, there aren't really any great flank routes at all there, right? Oftentimes, controlling that high ground, pushing people off that high ground, fighting it is a battle of attrition, and Sigma just does that really, really well. When the narrow hallway, the really long distances, Sigma controls the space and the angles better than any other tank. So while there are going to be some strategies I'll talk about to shut him down a bit, especially on the specific points on the specific maps, that's golden area for Sigma that is really hard to do anything about except for playing fundamental, playing really, really solid Overwatch. It doesn't really have to do with playing some weird strategy. Now, I'm not saying you can't win with a dive or an untraditional pick, but someone has to pop off in some major way versus the Sigma that is more fundamental, or everyone needs to be on the same page to enact like a certain dive-based strategy. There are some other counter strategies that are possible, of course, but they're not going to be as easy to access as Sigma is in ranked, just a Sigma poke comp. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about ways that you can deal with a Sigma as a DPS player. So, Sigma's really good when he gets to fight everything in front of him. He's not good when things are both in front of him and behind him. He has trouble with characters that can get behind him and characters that can fight behind him. Characters like Tracer, characters like Sombra, characters like Genji, characters that can fly are also problematic for him as well. So a lot of these characters can be really frustrating to deal with as a Sigma because Sigma cannot control everything around him all at once. Now, you still have to be careful of the rock. It can still shut you down. And of course, his team is going to be there trying to get you out of there. But places and positions you could play in that is like a little bit around the corner that allow you to pressure the Sigma from a different angle than what he's normally poking, and you're really hard to deal with. That is a great way to put a lot of pressure on a Sigma and force him to use some of his cooldowns early and then back up and then have to reset, right? Also, as a DPS, you can just go about the strategy of not interacting with the Sigma directly. So, like, oftentimes, like, let's take that map, for example, Circuit Royale first. There's going to be a Widow, most likely, on both sides, right? And if you're the better Widow, that Sigma can be better, but it doesn't really matter if you keep winning the Widow duel. It's going to be a little bit harder because that Sigma is going to pressure you more, and you're going to be losing the attrition a little bit more. But that Sigma could be doing quite a bit more than your Sigma, but if you're consistently getting kills and picks to take away some of the overall pool of poke that they have, your Sigma's going to be winning the fight because he has more resources, right, than them. So you just basically completely ignore the Sigma and you take the fight somewhere else. Now, one of the most powerful effects against the Sigma is characters that can displace his position, force him off high grounds in different areas. So, like concussing him as Pharah off of a high ground, booping him off, whipping him off as Brig, as Lucio. These are incredibly powerful effects up against the Sigma, because Sigmas want to route to the high ground. They want to take control of high grounds, and they don't have a great way to get up there, right? So forcing them down, forcing them to poke up, great thing to do. And a lot of those characters interact in a pretty favorable way up against the Sigma. Now, also, Sigma is just a character that is all about attrition and whittling down your resources. So keeping track of where you're positioned, how you're positioned, making sure that he is not able to just keep poking the same angle over and over again, farm a ton of ult charge, farm a ton of value from one position. He should have to split his attention, multiple angles. You're going to see that off-angling and generally spreading out the battlefield with good fundamental positions around natural cover is pretty much important no matter who you're playing against, but it can be really important up against Sigma. And then tracking his cooldowns, right? Knowing how much shield health he has, knowing when it's pressured, knowing when he has kinetic grasp, knowing when to respect rock. These are all just really important things because Sigma has a lot of tools at his disposal. And of course, he's going to play more defensively when he doesn't have these. So you want to force these out when you can. And you want to be able to do just enough to where it's like, okay, we broke its shield. We didn't let him pull it back. Or, oh, okay, we forced him to use kinetic grasp early. So now he has to play a bit more defensive. And that's going to be kind of where you force the Sigma to not play as aggressive, as consistent, get as much value in the neutral as he otherwise would. Now, generally, as far as the tank is concerned and just general strategy against Sigma, Sigma is good at poking. That's what he's best at. He wants to take a mid to slightly further than mid range, and that's his like sweet spot for where he wants his enemy, and he wants to corral people in. So everyone's in the same direction. Everyone is in that effective range of his, and he's able to poke you down and kind of control the whole fight, right? So you want to find ways to force your style of game. He's pretty bad up against close range. He has one rock, and that's it. Characters that can close in that gap against him can really take advantage of him, right? And especially if you see him waste cooldowns in the neutral. So like a Sigma that is just throwing a rock randomly in the neutral, or they throw it and they miss, then you can shout in as Queen. You can freaking pin in as Rhine. You can jump in as Winston. Sigma is not great when people are all up on him in his space, and if he doesn't respect you, then you can force that, especially when he uses his cooldowns, to force that kind of close effective range fight. And that's really how you're going to be able to take advantage of Sigma more than anything else. But we do got to talk about Winston. Winston can be a really strong tank, especially right now, to deal with. And there's a lot of things that Winston does really, really well. He enables his team to go in and create value with less damage taken and less abilities hit, right? If he bubbles off like a backline and his Tracer and Genji are in there, then those characters are going to be able to wiggle in and out of the bubble, take less overall damage. Maybe the bubble is going to eat a lot of cooldowns like sleep and just getting shot in general. So it's going to be a lot more effective, right? It's going to be a lot harder for enemies to defend it when that happens. But the other thing that Winston can do is cut off frontline and backline. Can cut off resources to the frontline from the backline surgically. So let's say Orion is playing up front. He's really aggressive and he's expecting help from his team. A Winston can jump in or drop in, bubble off the supports from the front line. And now it's an awkward situation. The tank can just pin back or run back or whatever to go back to his team, thus giving up a lot of space and angles for the Winston's team. Or the supports are in an awkward situation where they're like, hey, I need to help my tank, but I have to push through this bubble, through this Winston, make myself vulnerable to do so. So you put enemies in a really awkward, rock in a hard place situation, right? That's what a good Winston is able to do. That's what a good Winston wants to do. One of those two things, right? Direct jumping in the back, giving value to a backline, or cutting off resources. That's kind of what Winston is great at. So the first thing, when it comes to denying his dives, let's talk about it from a DPS perspective. You don't want to necessarily be isolated because you could be jumped on by the Winston. You want to oftentimes be in a position to help people that are getting dove or be helped by your team, right? This is really important, but on the same token, if their goal is to actually jump in altogether with the Winston, with the DPS, if you can find a moment in time to interrupt someone's cycle here, that could be a great way to where your team isn't overwhelmed. Because an experiment that I did as a kid was a bridge. We tried to create a bridge with popsicle sticks, right? And then we put a book over top of it. We kept on putting books over top of it until it broke, right? And you made a bridge, you made a popsicle stick bridge, and you put one book on top of it, was fine. You put two when it was a little bit harder. You put three, and it broke, right? And it's because all of the compounding of weight you crumble. Even with a great base, even with a great bridge, it crumbles, right? And so if the Genji and the Tracer and the Winston all jump at the same time, guess what? It's that 3 books. It crumbles. It crumbles the bridge. But if you can make it to where there's only 2 people, 2 books, then the bridge is fine. And you can keep putting 2 books on that bridge forever, and the bridge would be completely fine. That's why there's a weight limit. But the second there's 3 books, it crumbles, right? Because the compound of weight. You could have that bridge hold 2 books to the end of time, but it will never hold 3 books, right? And so the idea here is that if you can find a way to hit the Tracer on the flank, on the off angle, you're watching their routing, you're watching where they're going, you find an opportunity to buy time, to force them to use blinks, to force them to use recall, you bait out a Genji's deflect, you make him dash away, or you put a little pressure into a Winston. Whatever you have to do to where that Winston set up, he's ready to go, boom, he's ready to go. Hey, what the hell? Tracer, you're supposed to be with us. Sorry, I got shot, I had a recall. So now it's only 2, it's not 3. And that's what a DPS can do to mess up the Winston's all-in jumps. So that's a thing that you could do on DPS. You can do it on other roles, but specifically with DPS, especially DPS that don't have to fear getting dove by a Winston themselves. They play their effective range. They make sure that they are keeping track of where enemy DPS are situated. They can do a great job at interrupting that cycle. Now, if the Winston is trying to split, they just try to split the front line from the back line. They're trying to cut off support, heals, and things like that. This is a more common strategy in more neutral fights, and it's especially more common when there isn't a full all-in dive. Like if the Winston doesn't have a Genji and a Tracer and a Moira, everyone to go in, right? If the Winston has a Cass and an Ashe and an Ana, like he doesn't have the capability to just all-in jump the back line and enable people. Who's he enabling with this bubble? He's not enabling anybody. No one's going with him, right? So he has to split front line, back line, find opportunities where you're not really picking the most optimal thing to do, and then your team crumbles, right? So here you need to do what you can to neutralize the bubble as quickly as possible. And this could be done in a lot of different ways, but like as an example, your Cass, right-click, roll, right-click that bubble, get that bubble out, force that Winston to take damage or get away, and open up the line so that your backline can heal your Winston. Also, in general, you can play more up with your tank rather than necessarily stacking with your supports. And the main reason that you do this is because you want to deny splitting your team value. You don't want to just all stack on one side because then you're isolating your tank, right? If you're all stacking together, and you know that you can position differently because of their composition. If you have a freaking Ana and a Brig, or an Ana and a Lucio, a Winston by himself will not jump them and kill them with no support, no help, no other divers, right? And if they have not an all-in dive composition, you don't have to be worried about that. You don't need to be standing near your supports to bail them out because they don't need to be bailed out from that. But what you need to do is you need to protect your tank from being isolated and help your tank in situations where he's being overwhelmed, right? So your position changes, and you need to recognize that how you play changes depending on what type of composition they have, because if they have an all-in dive composition, they're going to play for more all-in dive. If they have a dive character in a more poke or different style of composition, they're going to be looking to split and separate surgically different parts of your team, access to different resources amounts, and you can position more aggressively, more with your tank, or more with an off-angle DPS appropriately to that, so that no one gets really cut off as easily because you're there to help them. Now, the same fundamental principle applies to supports as well. You just want to really identify what their team composition is, and through that, deduce what the Winston is trying to do. Make sure that you're ready to help each other in situations where you need to, based on the enemy composition, but you're also prepared to help your tank in a scenario where you get separated from them, you get split off, you cannot heal them, and you position relative to that so that you can still do something even in that bad situation. Now, as far as tank is concerned, every single tank is going to deal with a Winston in a different way. Some characters are really good at peeling Winstons. They can play in a way that denies them. Roadhog can do that particularly well. Junker Queen can peel if she's in the right position. Characters like Doom can peel as well. Diva can peel as well. But there's going to be some situations where you peeling gives up too much frontline pressure, and you peeling is going to take too long. So you would rather look for something to do on the front line, some way to hold them back, some way to mitigate them from helping the Winston, and give your team time to kind of stabilize a bit. And if you're not someone that needs resources and the Winston is trying to cut off your resources, just maybe waiting him out, waiting for the cycle to end, letting your team poke down the shield, poke out the Winston, and then the Winston wasted that cycle, and you didn't go too aggressive there, right? You didn't go too far in there because you don't have access to resources in that moment, but you don't need to because the Winston is trying to, you know, deny resources while you're focused down. But if you're fine, then he has to back up eventually. And then your team collectively can be aggressive. He doesn't have bubble. He's vulnerable. When he doesn't have all these resources, then, you know, you're going to be able to do whatever you want after the fact. Now, the next character that we have is Ball. And Ball can be one of those characters that can be really frustrating to deal with because he feels unkillable in some situations. Like, Ball feels like he's feeding and he's always mistiming his abilities and you're able to shut him down. Or he feels like he's literally unkillable. He's always slamming and you're always dying, right? And both of those can be frustrating. And I want to make it clear that Ball is a lot different from some of the other characters we talked about. Some characters like Winston and things like that because of the way that he interacts with the fight. So, first off, Ball can, of course, do the dive thing. He slams in. He has a whole bunch of divers. They all go in. They all super aggressive, right? In that situation, you need to make sure that you are ready to sustain that. And also, if you're a DPS or pretty much anyone, you want to find ways to interact with the other characters. You're not really going to be able to stop a Ball from engaging, but you can interact with another DPS, a Tracer, a Genji, whatever, force them to back off so that their timing isn't perfect. But the other thing that Ball can do is he can slam down, and then he can set up line of sights for support utility, for damage from DPS, and that can be a pretty difficult thing to deal with, especially if the Ball knows to time those slams with line of sight. By the way, a lot of Balls don't. I coached a lot of freaking Balls. I've coached many Balls to top 500 and Grandmaster. And yeah, not a lot of Balls slam appropriately. But when they do, it can be really frustrating because you're standing there in a reasonable position. You get booped out, you get slammed down, and then there's like a Cassidy that shoots you in the head, right? And you're just like, okay, I just got rolled. First off, you got to understand that there is a cycle of Ball coming in and getting out, right? Like when he's in and he all-in commits and he uses Adaptive Shield, and then you heal each other up and you force the Ball off. There's a window of time where the Ball's just not there on the front line, not there contesting the objective, not there helping their team. And that's kind of the window of opportunity for you to take a lot of space, be aggressive, and go find value there. But I would say in general, you need to be really careful about where you're positioning relative to the enemy DPS because a Ball can come in and interact with any duel, any place on the map. So you could be a DPS, right? You could be a Cass or an Ashe, and you're fighting another DPS on the off angle, and that Ball could just roll in and slam you, or roll you out of position, or engage in that fight, or finish you off after you got them low, or you're low. So that's something that you need to be careful of. Unlike other characters, splitting up oftentimes on these far off angles can be really punishing up against a Ball. And in many cases, it's better to play a little bit closer together so that y'all can bail each other out. Because if that Ball slam can get neutralized, then the time that the Ball is out of the fight can be really taken advantage of by your team, your tank. So you're trying to minimize the impact of those big slams. Now, the number one question I get is, should I focus the Ball? Should I shoot the Ball? My team never kills the Ball. The Ball's unkillable. So when the Ball comes in, you need to do enough to get the Ball away, to force the Ball off, right? You want the Ball to leave, but after the Ball leaves, you don't want to chase them, pursue them, you know, double blink, triple blink, chase them around the map, all that stuff. Similar to what we talked about with the Hog, don't allow your lust to kill this person. Make it so that you make a mistake, right? That's not what we're trying to do here. The goal is to minimize his effectiveness, minimize the moments that he comes in. If we can endure those, they're going to come in, he's going to do something, he's going to slam, he's going to create value or try to. If we can sustain there, we turtle up, we sustain, then boom, now we have a huge advantage because they don't got a front line for a while. They don't have, I mean, he cannot be a front line at all. So you have a huge advantage as long as you don't allow those moments. It's like you're bracing for impact, right? Those moments you brace for impact, you save your cooldowns, you conserve, you make sure that no one dies, you focus that Ball, you get him away, but then you don't do too much more. You don't keep focusing him, you don't keep chasing him, you don't waste all your cooldowns on him if you don't need to, but you make sure to keep everyone alive. And then your DPS and the rest of you should be able to just leverage the fact that they don't have any freaking front line at all. Now for DPS, there's a ton of super effective DPS against Ball. Characters like Sombra are really, really great at shutting him down, obviously. Characters like Cassidy can be very frustrating for a Ball. So yeah, I mean, just generally, most characters that don't die to a Ball and can threaten him in some way, they're reasonable against a Ball. And then For support, things that can deny him generally, so Brig is extremely good. Being able to sleep him is pretty powerful, even though Ana can be a target. It depends on the composition. If there are divers, Ana against a ball plus divers can be a little bit difficult, but characters that have great mobility, characters like Kiriko that have Suzu, these can be really good. Anyone that can fade away or jump away from the ball slamming down, all fantastic. And then for tanks, I think as long as you make a conscious effort to shut down the ball cycles, you're going to be perfectly fine. You cannot ignore the ball. You really want to peel for those brace for impact moments, but then you can go back to doing your own thing, right? DM the moment that he slams down as D.Va. Try to punch cancel the slam down on ball. If you time it right, you can cancel out the actual slam damage and everything. Junker Queen, you can knife him, you can cleave him, you can get him the hell out, you can shout your team. Mauga, I mean, yeah, it's pretty obvious. Orisa, you can javelin him. Ram, you can't really interact with him in a great way, but it can be a great opportunity for you to brawl out in his backline when he's not there to help the team and trade out. Ryan, another character that can't really interact with ball, but once again, you play to what you can do, right? You can try to pin him if you think you can hit it, but you can also just go to his backline and start brawling out and start to threaten those characters. Hog can hook him, pretty simple. Sigma can rock him. Winston, you're going to often want to trade out and dive into their backline. That's typically reasonable, although using a bubble defensively when they have divers or even hit scan can be a reasonable thing to do to protect your team in that moment. And then Zarya can bubble their team, defensive bubbles, endure, protect, and then you can walk forward and take that front line that is given to you for free. Now, the last but certainly not least character on this list is Zarya. We just talked about her, and it can be pretty frustrating when a Zarya is like killing everyone in the lobby. So let's say what you can do to shut down the Zarya across the role. So first off, let's talk about Zarya's strengths. She is a character that once she picks up momentum, can break through the front line, dip into back lines, and just melt people, right? And there's not really much you can do about it when she sets up those, because she can, you know, bubble herself, protect you from all forms of damage, CC, and can kill you in like a matter of seconds. Super, super strong. So if a Zarya can get to that high charge, which is the first solution to not allowing her to dominate, is making sure that she doesn't get high charge, which you just have to be disciplined around bubbles. But there's a caveat here. And the caveat is, if a Zarya is really out of position, relying on her bubbles to survive, the best way to make it so a Zarya doesn't have constantly high charge is by killing her, killing the Zarya. So you need to make sure that if you ever pull the trigger on, oh, she's out, she has only one bubble, she used it, I'm going to break this bubble and I'm going to kill her. If you commit to that, you need to make sure that it's possible. And it's a good idea if you have communication, because you want to punish the Zarya. Don't allow her to get away with this type of stuff when she really shouldn't. And I will say that Zaryas, as they climb the ranks, get away with a lot, because people always say, don't shoot the bubbles, don't shoot the bubbles. And they're still getting high charge because they're just staying alive and they're never dying. And they're getting away with a lot of things they shouldn't get away with because no one ever shoots at them because they're afraid of charging a bubble. So it can be a double-edged sword there. You got to be really careful about that. And then the other thing that Zarya is kind of lacking, most specifically, is no mobility, no great mobility. Besides a couple of alternate fire jumps here and there, Zarya cannot chase you around. So she has a hard time catching up to characters, and she's really good at punishing characters that stay in the same position for a long period of time. So if you want to succeed against the Zarya, being able to constantly move and adjust your position according to hers can be the first step into overall not dying or getting farmed by the Zarya nearly as freaking much. Now, from a DPS point of view, Zarya is a character that you want to respect her damage, you want to respect her range, but you also want to try to burst her down and force her to use bubbles. So a headshot, a crit, that's the easiest way to just force a Zarya to use her bubble. But there's other ways to be really frustrating against a Zarya. Zarya cannot interact with flyers. Once again, a lot of tanks cannot. She also cannot do anything about flankers. She cannot do anything about a tracer that is constantly behind her shoulder. She cannot do anything about a lot of these characters that are constantly harassing her. And she's really bad against characters that can take the high ground on a whim. So even a character like Hanzo, even though he's relatively bad right now, I'm sure he'll get some changes at some point. So depending on when you see this, maybe he's actually the best DPS in the game. I don't know. But the fact that Zarya could go to the high ground, try to flush him off, he drops, she goes down with him, he goes back up. She can never deal with that character. And that's one of her core weaknesses, is that she doesn't have the ways to change any verticality, right? So she's really kind of a slave to her pathing. She has to path appropriately, and pathing can be interrupted. There's a lot of characters that can just constantly change their path. They don't care about their path, or they can play outside of her effective range always because they have great mobility. Now, for supports in particular, for Zarya, you need to make sure to, 1, respect her effective range. Super, super important. 2, if the Zarya is enabling a lot of characters with bubble, I would say you need to be a little bit extra disciplined with the cooldowns that you're using, because you don't want them to get shut down by a bubble completely. You waste that sleep dart or that damage on a character that gets bubbled because you fired it a little bit too early and you didn't respect the bubble, you're just gonna die. I mean, you're just gonna just straight up die. Sometimes the best way to make it so that a Zarya can't do this is by punishing the Zarya herself, because she has one less bubble for herself, right? You're making that Zarya feel like they need to bubble themselves more, and they just do that just to survive, so they don't have the capacity to like enable everyone on their team, bubble, peel every single person. So it's really important to also just play your effective range against the Zarya, really play your distance against the Zarya, be disciplined with the areas that you're spamming damage and utility against the Zarya, because she'll get a lot of charge. And if I were to give you characters that are really great against the Zarya, having a Lucio is really, really strong, especially if they don't have a Lucio. Any character that can play distance or force distance, characters that can run away from Zarya, characters like GearUP are all fantastic. And then characters that can really burst her down and force her to use a lot of resources. Even a character like Zen can be good in the right situation, because you can help burst through Zarya's outermost layer. You can discord her, force her to use a ton of bubbles at a much more rapid pace, but you still need to make sure that you're distancing yourself appropriately and you're not falling victim to the Zarya getting a lot of charge, bursting to the front line. Now, as a tank, and I would say that this is one of the characters that DPS support, they kind of just play the way that they normally play, but for tanks in particular, this is the character that you need to adjust your play the most against, because she's not a character that you can realistically fight on the front line very easily. And there's a lot of characters that want to beat up on the front line. They just want to beat up the enemy tank on the front line. You can't really do that well against Zarya. If you're Orisa, if you're Junker Queen, you're going to have a really rough time when the Zarya is max charge and able to double bubble and just deal with you, or double bubble herself while she ignores you and you look helplessly while she kills your team and you can't do anything to interact with it, right? So you need to, 1, find ways to avoid a Zarya when necessary. Keep in mind, Zarya doesn't have a great way to mobilize, get mobile, get into your team. So if your team is positioned relatively well, I know that that's a far cry, but it's not your job to save them from a Zarya that walks at them. That person is not coming at them. It's not like with the ball example, where the ball is flying from across the map and slamming right onto your Ana. You need to save that Ana, because that Ana can do nothing to deny that ball from getting on top of her. But if your Ana is standing on the front line and getting walked at by a Zarya, well, tough luck, because you can't do anything about that. And it's important to make sure that you don't allow yourself to keep making these mistakes, assuming that every single player on your team is always going to be perma-bad, because you're just going to create bad habits, and you're never going to win because you're always trying to stop something you just can't stop. Now, other times, this means to just completely ignore the Zarya and force the Zarya in a situation where she feels like she needs to peel, right? And a bubble can be a decent peel, but really the Zarya wants to be there. So as long as the Zarya is in a position to constantly need or want to peel, they're not on the front line, they're not in your back line, they're not really being oppressive or applying a lot of pressure in a way that another tank would be just existing. Because Zarya wants to get in and fight in order to apply that pressure, unlike characters like Sigma or even characters like Ram, that can be getting value from range, play pretty passive and still get value. They don't have to push up and be all up in the fight. Not the same way as Zarya can. So basically, there's going to be some moments where you're just ignoring the Zarya, jumping past, forcing that Zarya to respect you and respect what you can do just as much as you respect what she can do. And then depending on the character you're playing, just play your character's strengths. If you're Sigma, play your range. If you're Doomfist, look for opportunities to burst past her and use your CC to push her back out of your team, away from your team. So you're making sure that she doesn't interrupt your game plan, but you respect hers and you find ways to get your game plan through when you can't interact with her in a great way. And with Zarya, the best way to dominate her is with good positioning. And I have a positioning guide on this channel you can definitely check out. But if you have absolutely any questions on how to counter a tank in Overwatch, I will definitely respond to you in the comments down below. And I'm going to have more videos on how to counter other characters. What other videos do you want to see next? Definitely subscribe and let me know down below. Thank you so much for coming by. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.